Good evening and welcome to the ICAS Spring Symposium Veritas 2022. And thank you everyone for joining our program today. I'm Shinja Kim, President and Chair of ICAS. And it's my pleasure to introduce today's special guest speaker, Professor Joseph S. Nye, Jr., who will address the issues and challenges with regards to the Ukraine war, Indo-Pacific, Northeast Asia, and the U.S. national security. Professor Nye is University Distinguished Professor Emeritus and former Dean of Harvard Kennedy School of Government. He received his bachelor's degree summa cum laude from Princeton University. He won a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford and earned a PhD in political science from Harvard. Joseph has served as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, Chair of National Intelligence Council, and Deputy Undersecretary of State, and he won a Distinguished Service Award from all three agencies. His books include The Future of Top Power, The Power Game, Do Morals Matter, and a Washington novel. Joseph is a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the British Academy, and American Academy of Diplomacy. In a recent survey of international relations scholars, he was ranked as the most influential scholar on American foreign policy, and in 2011, Foreign Policy named him one of the top 100 global thinkers. In 2014, Japan awarded Joseph the Order of the Rising Sun. So with that, today is such an honor to have Professor Joseph Nye here with us, and hope you enjoy the program, and let's welcome Professor Joseph Nye. Thank you.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you at ICAS tonight, by my time, the morning for you. But I'm also impressed that there are many more people on this call who know as much or more about the subject tonight as I do. So I'm looking forward to a conversation in which I'll welcome other views and we look forward to hearing other views. But to start with the question of the Ukraine war, and then to broaden it out and to relate it to Asia and then to Korea, I think the Ukraine war was going to go down as one of the classic miscalculations in history, in the sense that it's analogous to something like Napoleon's decision to invade Russia in 1812, or something like Hitler's decision to invade Russia in 1941. It's unleashed enormous consequences, which are global, not just local. And I think that we're only seeing the early stages of it. The interesting question is what will happen, and obviously nobody knows. But I've just written a column for Project Syndicate, and what I call the 8 lessons we know so far about the Ukraine war. And the important thing, as I conclude at the end of it, is that the illusion of a short war has always been very seductive and often turned out to be disastrous. My view is that Putin expected that his so-called special military operation was going to be somewhat like the Soviet takeover of Budapest in 1956 or Prague in 1968. In a few days or a week or so, he would have captured Kyiv, perhaps Kharkiv as well, would have overthrown Zelensky, put in his own puppet, declared independence for the 2 regions of Donbass as independent republics, and he could have declared victory and got out. This would have been quite an accomplishment at a relatively low cost, since he probably could have gotten away with a good deal of it. Of course, that wasn't what happened, and we're seeing the aftermath now with 4 months of a war, which is not only killing thousands of Ukrainians and Russians, but is also plausibly going to kill thousands of Africans and Asians. If you look at the problems of food supply, not to mention energy supply, but particularly food, and the blockading of Odessa and the export of Ukrainian grain through the Black Sea, this can have enormous effects on parts of Africa, which are already suffering from food shortages because of climate change. So I think that we're seeing a calculation which was supposed to be a short, sharp war, just as in August 1914, the leaders of the major European powers thought that a good, quick war would clear the air regarding the balance of power and the troops would be home for Christmas. Of course, we know now that the troops didn't get home for Christmas. They didn't get home for 4 more years. And after that, 4 of the empires that were involved had been dismantled, and 4 of the leaders had lost their thrones. We don't know what will happen to Putin or how long it will take, but I suspect that when we look at this 10 years from now, we'll look back at it as a classic miscalculation. Now, what about how long it will take? In the early stages, many people thought, well, you can have a quick settlement of some sorts. Putin will be able to claim a corridor from the Crimea to the Donbass, and you'll have some sort of diplomatic settlement. You might call it Minsk III. In other words, not a terribly meaningful settlement, but a covering up of an aggression, and that would return the world to normal. And so the food the disasters that I mentioned, or the extraordinary effects on the world economy of the high energy prices and the way that's driving inflation, that these could be overcome. It would have been an unfortunate period, but it wouldn't go on forever. I think now most people are saying that this war could go on for a very long time. If you look at the prospects for a bargain solution, it's going to be very hard for Zelensky, given the atrocities that have occurred and the mobilization of the Ukrainian population. What Putin has done is stimulated enormous Ukrainian nationalism, some of which was there and some of which Putin helped to create. It's going to be very hard, particularly since Zelensky has said he will put any proposed truce or settlement to a referendum. It's hard to see how Zelensky gives in to the demands that Putin is going to make. On the other hand, Putin, having staked his reputation on the view that Ukraine is not a true nation, but is part of an ancient Ruski Mir, and that the Donbass republics of Luhansk and Donetsk are to be properly recognized as Russian republics, and that eventually Russia will control the area. It's hard to see Putin stepping back from that. Some people have said you need to give him an exit ramp. In a sense, he can create an exit ramp anytime he wants, but it's hard to see an exit ramp that's going to satisfy not only his domestic position at home, but also his illusions of grandeur as another Peter the Great, who is going to restore Ruski Mir. So I'm afraid that, much as I don't like to say it, that we may be seeing a prolonged stalemate. Sometimes people call this a frozen conflict. That's the wrong term. It might be better to think of a simmering conflict in which the Russians can turn up or down the heat at different times. And if their aim is to prevent Ukraine from becoming a normal state which is oriented toward Europe, that may be enough to achieve their goals. But then you need to keep the conflict alive, not reach a settlement. You may have something like a Minsk III or a Minsk IV covering up the realities, but the realities are that this can be a prolonged situation. So that's my view of where we are in the origins and the current situation in the Ukraine war. Now, what does it mean for Asia? And then we'll turn to what it means for Korea. In Asia, obviously, it has disrupted what you might call the axis of the authoritarians to some extent. When Putin and Xi met at the Olympics before the invasion on February 24th, it's alleged that Putin may have told Xi what was coming, but it seems likely that it was telling him something about a special military operation as originally intended. I doubt that Putin said this could be a long, prolonged war. And Xi, who wanted to keep his alliance with Russia tight because his concern was with the Americans and maintaining the alliance with Russia as a way to fend off the Americans, Xi came basically to Russia's defense, at least rhetorically, in the sense that he has used his propaganda machine essentially to repeat the Russian claims of the origins of the war in NATO enlargement, rather than Putin's grandiose views of Ruski Mir, and that he is also basically regarded the prospect that some people have suggested, including some people in Beijing early on in the conflict, that China could gain a lot from becoming a moderating force, and Xi could win himself a Nobel Prize and help his friend Vladimir out of a bad situation by a little coercive moderation, a little bit like Teddy Roosevelt did in 1904 with the Russo-Japanese War. But there's no sign of that. And those voices which were heard early on in Beijing have been totally scienced. So what you've seen is a reinforcement of the Russia-China axis. But it's interesting that even within that framework, China has been careful not to go too far, not to provide Russia with either military equipment or not to break the American sanctions. And part of the reason for this is that they don't want to suffer secondary sanctions themselves. So there is, it was promised to be a friendship without limits. Actually, it turns out to be a friendship of convenience with limits. But it does lead to a situation where in Asia you have a divide between the authoritarians focused on China and the neutral states like India and the more democratic states, of course, like Japan and Korea. So there is a impact on Asia, which is obvious in the effects on the economies with inflation and energy prices and food prices, but there's also an effect on the, if you want, the politics, the political alignments, the geopolitics, the question of where the Americans were going to be. They have been badly damaged by some of the statements by the Trump administration, and it was a little unclear about, even though Biden was restoring American alliances as his goal, it was unclear what that was going to mean. But in any case, it meant in practice that the U.S. sense of U.S. guarantees, I think, were reinforced. The fact that NATO, which Emmanuel Macron had called brain dead just a short time before the war, NATO responded so quickly and so thoroughly, And the Americans, who were supposed to be totally paralyzed by their partisan differences at home, were able to get broad bipartisan support for $40 billion or more in aid and military equipment to Ukraine, I think had a certain demonstration effect. In addition to that, there was in democratic societies like Japan and Korea, a sense of shock and revulsion at some of the pictures of atrocities in Bucha and the very fact of the overt Russian aggression. So in that sense, you could make an argument that the effects of the Ukraine war in Asia were, if anything, to somewhat reinforce the alliance systems. At the same time, it's worth noticing that the situation in Asia, which is probably most analogous in some people's mind to Ukraine, which is the situation of Taiwan, there were people who were predicting a Chinese invasion of Taiwan within 4 years. I think my own view is that the prospects of the Chinese invasion of Taiwan have been reduced in that 4-year period, in the sense that if Putin couldn't carry out a successful capture of Kyiv with massed troops on a land border in a friendly country like Belarus, the idea of mounting an amphibious operation against Taipei, I think, looks a little less plausible. And if Xi Jinping has as a major objective his control of the Communist Party and the Communist Party's control of China, which I think is a shorthand version of his objectives, one of the few things that could upset that would be a failed expedition against Taiwan. So I think in that sense, it may be that people can sleep a little bit easier in Taipei, not very, but a little bit easier in Taipei as a result of the war in Ukraine. But I'd be interested to hear others on the call dispute that or give their views on that. Now, what does it mean specifically for Korea? Korea has a set of problems unlike those of anyone else, namely across the 38th parallel, a communist monarchy, a third generation of rule by the Kim family, and which has an active nuclear program. We don't quite know how they have survived or what will be the net effect of COVID. But we do have a situation where the North Korean problem and threat remains. And I don't think the Ukrainian war has changed that all that much. The Biden administration has said that it is moving away from the sort of benign neglect or strategic patience, as it was called, of the Obama administration, and that they're ready to have negotiations anywhere, anytime, any place. But it's clear that Kim Jong-un is not picking up his part of that. At the same time, the extent to which China was trying to be helpful, which was limited with support of UN sanctions in terms of trying to pull back or tame North Korea, China seems to now have moved away from that position and to be unwilling to do anything that really seems to be working closely with the Americans. So the North Korean situation seems to me as fraught and difficult as ever, and I don't think it's been changed much by the war in Ukraine, though I'd be eager to hear people with different views dispute that point as well. Where that leaves us then in terms of Korea is, in my view, the importance of reaffirming extended deterrence. And there, I think the important point is that people have been talking in Korea about developing a Korean nuclear weapon or restationing American short-range nuclear weapons in Korea or something of that sort. I've always said that the real guarantee of extended deterrence is the stationing of troops in Korea. Or the same thing goes for Japan. But the fact that you have 28,000 American troops means that we in South Korea are locked in what you might call a community of fate. A North Korean attack on South Korea, particularly a nuclear attack, is going to kill Americans. And the idea that we could suddenly step back and say, oh, well, we're not involved. No, that's not going to happen. That gives you much more credibility to extended deterrence than restationing tactical nukes in South Korea would be. So in that sense, there are lots of things we can do. We can improve missile defense. We can improve some of the exercises that we, South Korea and the United States, have working together to enhance the credibility of our extended deterrence. But I think the key to my mind is that reinforcing the unity between Washington and Seoul, which I think was somewhat damaged by the statements and behavior of the Trump administration, so that we have extended deterrence, so that North Korea can't have any temptations of what it would try to do. I think that to me is key. But I think that is unchanged by the Ukraine war. If anything, the extent to which you've seen a reinforcement of alliances in Europe as a result of the Ukraine war, and the fact that that shows that the Americans are not retreating inward, that may help to increase the credibility of the extended deterrence that we have in Korea. But in short, I think that Ukraine war is a horrible miscalculation, which has had disastrous effects on world politics. But I don't think it has made the situation in Asia much worse off. Might be slightly better off. But this is since none of us know where this is going or how it's going to turn out, as I said at the beginning, I'm much more interested in hearing other people's views on this, since nobody has a complete answer to this. So let me stop there. Sorry to have gone on so long, but it is a fair amount of distance to cover.
Thank you, Professor Nye. Before we go over to the next stage, let me make a brief comment. ICAS is not an agent of any government or foreign principles. There's no foreign funds involved in the ICAS activities. Thank you. Hey, Patrick, go ahead.
Well, thank you very much. And Bruce, there is a red mute button on the bottom. It should be on the bottom of your screen there. You should be able to find after I ask this question. Not surprisingly, I agree with everything Professor Joe Nye has just said. I want to kind of try to tease him out, though, in terms of history and in terms of the larger question of nuclear stability. When you think about the nuclear non-proliferation regime, you think about the nuclear taboo. Both of those are holding, but how sustainable are they? And the extended deterrence question is a third pillar of that, and the one you answered in part. But all three of them, I think, there are questions. These things are not fixed in time, as you know. They're things that have to be fought over. And I'm considering the 1970s, when our US-ROK alliance was less than ironclad, a word we like to use a lot about the alliance. And it is ironclad today, perhaps, but it certainly wasn't in the 1970s when Park Chung-hee was considering the need for nuclear weapons, as after the Guam Doctrine of 1969, after President Nixon wanted to unilaterally withdraw the 7th Infantry Division in 1971, and President Park wanted to be sure he could deter North Korea's conventional advantage, and he wanted to be less dependent on the United States because he wasn't sure how reliable they are. So you rightly pointed out all the things we could do to reaffirm both deterrence and to reassure our ally South Korea. and we have a strong ally in South Korea right now. But when you think about these issues over time, this is 2022. Are we heading toward a period when nuclear stability, the taboo, the proliferation regime, and extended deterrence are all increasingly in question, or are they still relatively stable? I mean, again, you were on the commission back in the Ford Foundation in MITRE in 1977, a key report, a watershed, and many of these things have been exactly stabilized by that period. And yet, is it going to continue to be stable going forward? I'm sorry to ask such a long question, but I'm hoping to draw out some of your deep experience.
Well, as usual, Patrick, you've got the right question. And I wish I had the right answer, but let me give it a try. I think the Ukraine war has done damage to the nuclear taboo. Putin has certainly rattled his nuclear saber. On the other hand, notice the limits of that, in which it's not the first time we've seen nuclear signaling for coercive purposes. Remember, Henry Kissinger raised the DEFCON level to number 3 at the time of the Yom Kippur War in 1973. So we too have sometimes used nuclear signaling. What strikes me is that from people who have looked carefully at what the Russians have actually done on their nuclear threats, it's been rhetorical, and the slight changes they made in defensive or alert postures really didn't go very far. I mean, it was baby steps rather than major steps. So in that sense, I think the nuclear taboo still seems to be in place, but we better be very careful to make clear to the Russians that if they break that threshold, that if they've seen problems so far, there are going to be much greater problems. On the Non-Proliferation Treaty, I think there has been some damage done by the Russian attack, particularly since the Ukrainians seem to have given up nuclear weapons in the Budapest Agreement, and the Russians violated the guarantee that they gave at that time. But I think it's also important not to overlearn the lessons of the Ukrainian war on this. People sometimes assume that there were sort of on-the-shelf nuclear weapons that the Ukrainians could just take off the shelf and they'd have a ready-made deterrent. In fact, the missiles that were inherited from the Soviet Union were not particularly useful for deterring a next-door neighbor like Russia. And if the Ukrainians had actually tried to dismantle those weapons and take out the fissile material and repurpose it for newly invented short-range missiles or tactical weapons, it's possible they could have invited a Russian attack sooner rather than later. So I think we have to be careful not to let the mythology of the Ukrainians had a working nuclear deterrent and they gave it up. They didn't. And there is a problem with proliferation, which is you might imagine a country being more secure after it has a nuclear weapon because it has a deterrent, but it has to get there from here. And the process of getting there from here may lead to greater vulnerability and greater danger and greater instability. So I think that, yes, there has been some damage done to the non-proliferation regime. But again, I think some of the conventional wisdom about Ukrainians giving up their nuclear weapons exaggerates that. So those would be my main answers. But I think the most important one is the one that you said. Nobody knows how this is going to play out. If I had, if imagine the Ukrainians do very well, they push Putin back toward territorial boundaries for February 23rd, and Putin says, I can't possibly tolerate this, and he uses a tactical nuclear weapon, that would be a huge change. I think the probabilities of that are quite low, but they're not zero. And similarly, on the proliferation side, the incentives to have a weapon, I think you're better off with extended deterrence than to develop your own weapon. But if you have a return of Donald Trump in 2024, and he talks about removing American troops from Korea or Japan, that's going to make a big difference in terms of incentives in Korea and in Japan. It's what I talked about as a community of fate. There were 50,000 American troops in Japan and 28,000 in Korea. I mean that detachment is impossible. We are both in this together, so to speak. But if you have a returned Trump who decides to withdraw those American troops, then you're in a different world. So as of now, I think there's a low probability of collapse of the nuclear taboo or the non-proliferation regime. But, history is full of surprises.
Thank you. Bruce, are you ready?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, good. Go ahead, Bruce.
Good. All right. We solved the problem.
Okay.
If you look at Charles de Gaulle in the late 1950s, not unlike him, many South Koreans have started to doubt the U.S. nuclear umbrella. And the measures you talked about don't seem to be making the difference required. And there's particular concern that at some point North Korea might field 20 or 30 ICBMs with nuclear weapons to really raise questions about the U.S. willingness to trade Seoul for San Francisco or Los Angeles. So with the United States apparently not reining in the North Korean ICBM and nuclear weapon production efforts, what should the United States be doing to sustain the nuclear umbrella and avoid a rock decision to develop its own nuclear weapons?
Well, I think the main answer is the one I gave, which is solidifying our alliance with South Korea, not only by keeping troops there, but by exercising them, by increasing missile defense and other South Korean capabilities are the things that I would put top of the agenda. But I also think that we can exaggerate the impact of North Korea developing a capacity to hit the United States. After all, if we could deter the Soviet Union from, taking Berlin when they had tens of thousands of nuclear weapons, and the city of Berlin was surrounded by Soviet troops, and people said, we're not going to trade Berlin for New York. And yet, you know what? Over 40 years, we were able to preserve the independence of Berlin. And despite that balance of forces. So if deterrence works against the Soviets, I think deterrence will work against the Kim regime. Sometimes people have the view, well, Kim is a madman or, something of that sort. I don't think so. I think his major objective is to keep the Kim dynasty in power. And the one thing would definitely get rid of the Kim dynasty for all of history is an attack on the United States. So obviously, from Kim's point of view, he wants to threaten the Americans with long-range missiles and talk about hitting San Francisco and so forth. And the answer to that, you do, and that's the end of you and your regime. So I think that I don't see any reason why deterrence at the strategic level shouldn't work there. I think what we really have to think about is deterrence on the Korean Peninsula, and that's why I emphasize steps that are more focused locally. I think the great danger is if we make a big difference between, let's say, long-range missiles and intermediate-range missiles, and say that we must stop the long-range missiles, the ICBMs, and that creates a bad impression on our allies, both in Korea and Japan, that all we care about is saving San Francisco. We care about saving Seoul and Tokyo as well. And so just to say, you know, to Kim, well, you can have a few medium range missile tests, but just don't try any ICBMs. The answer to that is not to divide the American alliance with Japan or the American alliance with Korea. It's to say to Kim, try it, and that's the end. Finished. Your 3-generation regime is gone forever. And that, to me, is the answer.
Thank you. Joe Detrani, Ambassador Detrani, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Sanju.
Go ahead.
Professor Joe Nye, great seeing you, and what a lovely presentation. You covered everything so well. Look, thanks for your continued leadership in working these issues that affect our nation's security and the security of our allies and partners. I mean, the work you've done over the years and you continue to do is just outstanding. You know, let me get to the question, and I'll lead into the question with this comment. Estimates of North Korea's stockpile of nuclear weapons and the ballistic missiles that can deliver those nuclear weapons, the estimates are relatively impressive. I mean, we're now talking about the possibility of a 7th nuclear test. The last one was a thermonuclear test. We had 31 missiles launched in 2022. We had an ICBM launched in 2025 May. Submarine launched ballistic missiles, hypersonics, etc. So Kim Jong-un has said, he said that at the 8th Party Congress in January 2021, he's going to work on these systems. He's going to upgrade his nuclear capabilities, his ballistic missile capabilities, and he's doing that in spades. So, and I think most analysts would agree it's unlikely North Korea is going to give up their nuclear weapons. I mean, they look at Libya, Iraq, and Ukraine, despite the comments you made on Ukraine, and I agree with your comments on that, but they did see not only the former Soviet Union or the Russian Federation, but the United States and the UK. We all provided security assurances with the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, and that didn't mean much when Russia invaded. So the likelihood of giving up his nuclear weapons, I think most analysts would say it's unlikely to nil. So, and they won't come back to negotiations. So my question is this: how would you respond, Professor Nye, given your deep experience on all these issues? How would you respond to those who say, let's just accept North Korea as a nuclear weapon state and enter into arms control negotiations with them, and let's forget this complete verifiable denuclearization?
Well, Joe, you know North Korea much better than I do, and you've spent a lifetime in service to solving this problem. So I should be putting the question to you, and or maybe I'll give you my answer, but then ask you your version of the answer. I think that I agree with you. I think the prospects of North Korea or the Kim regime giving up nuclear weapons is very, very low, if not zero, at least asymptotic to zero. I mean, but I think the idea of keeping the long-term goal of a denuclearized Korean peninsula is a worthy goal. And then you say, if in the meantime, what do we set as objectives? You can think about things about test bans, or both for missiles and for nuclear weapons. You can, and those are to some extent verifiable by when you see them or hear them. And you can also talk about ways in which you can reduce tensions between, the states, trying to reduce the degree of overt hostility. But I think you're right that the idea that we're going to bargain away North Korea's nuclear weapons is fanciful. I mean, when Donald Trump went to meet with Kim Jong-un and promising that it was everything for everything, I thought that was absolutely naive, and I think it proved to be so. So I think trying to find interim moderate proposals which would limit some of the North Korean progress is worthwhile. But I would not give up, for example, South Korean American exercises. I would not give up anything which is essential to our deterrent. In other words, if you're going to take the realistic position, which I think is correct, that whatever our long run goal of a denuclearized Korea Peninsula, it's not going to happen anytime soon, and that the North is still going to be a threat, then we have to make sure that anything we agree to with the North Koreans, whether we call it arms control or whatever, doesn't weaken our deterrent. To me, the key to not the solving, but the living with this North Korean threat is effective deterrence. But what's your answer?
Well, let me just say, no, what an outstanding answer. No, I agree with you. Extended deterrence is outstanding. Thank you, Professor Nye. Outstanding.
Tong Kim, go ahead.
Yes, thank
Go
you.
ahead. Okay.
Thank you, Professor. I was wondering whether you think the deterrent can be somehow supplemented by diplomatic efforts. And if you do, what, for example, would you recommend the administration do, knowing that it's not highly unlikely they're going to respond to requests for any talks anytime soon, but nevertheless, there should be some kind of a diplomatic effort. What they should be like?
Well, I think that we can't, I think, do what the Obama administration did and in the name of strategic patience, sort of have benign neglect and just assume that the North Koreans will put up with that. The trouble is, like a petulant child that is ignored, they can scream and fight and cause a fuss, and so we ought to be using diplomacy to reduce that, to give them some prospect of some benefit from calmer relations in the short run. If they don't egregiously misbehave, and that's, to me, that's the role of diplomacy, and that's a more realistic goal for diplomacy than the goal of bargaining away North Korea's nuclear weapons. So what could we do? The diplomacy that Trump was offering related to reducing American troops or curtailing American exercises, I thought that was, as I mentioned, a big mistake because it weakened our deterrent capability, which to my mind is the key to managing this situation. So if I were to say, what would I put on the table? I might want to start with something like humanitarian assistance, help for vaccines for COVID, or food assistance given the rise in food prices that's coming. And so if I start at the humanitarian end, I don't have to get into this issue of removing all sanctions or having a package deal in which it's everything for everything. And I think I'd start with my diplomacy in an area like that.
Thank you. Don Kerr, you have very nice haircut. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Secretary Blinken has talked about a possible change in U.S. military posture in retaliation for a North Korean seventh nuclear test. What actually can the U.S. do aside from engaging in rhetoric and maybe sending a few big planes and flying around in intimidation flights, etc.? What can the U.S. do? And of course, there's the UN too. What can the U.S. do about a seventh nuclear test, going beyond these gestures, which may or may not have the slightest effect on North Korea?
Well, I think I don't know what Tony Blinken had in mind when he made that comment, but you could imagine, another THAAD system. You could imagine improving short-run tactical missile defenses for South Korea. You could imagine let's say putting major efforts into boost phase missile defense, which can be positioned off the coasts of Korea. So there are things we can do without that. None of these are going to solve the problem, but they can indicate that we are taking it seriously.
Very good. David Maxwell. Go ahead, David.
Good evening. Thank you, Professor. I really appreciate your comments, and I'd certainly reinforce all your comments about not canceling exercises and not withdrawing troops. And I would just offer those 28,500 troops are essential to the functioning of the ROK U.S. Combined Forces Command, which is the warfighting headquarters charged with deterrence and defense. So it's absolutely necessary that those forces train and maintain readiness, because that does contribute to deterrence, but more importantly, it contributes to the actual capability to defend South Korea from an attack. I would like to say that in terms of all the comments and conversations here, one thing that we have not mentioned is how to prove to Kim Jong-un that his political warfare strategy, his blackmail diplomacy, is failing. It does not work. And I actually think that in the past couple months, the response by the Biden administration, now the Yoon administration, of strategic assets deployed to Guam, Okinawa, carrier battle group to the East Sea, and a myriad of exercises, and a restarting of our major exercises on a more robust scale, actually is a response that indicates that Kim Jong-un cannot achieve the effects that he wants, that we're not going to appease him. And I'm heartened by President Yoon's words that he calls North Korea the main enemy, that he wants South Korea to step up. And after the summit, he said to CNN, there will be no more appeasement of North Korea. So question is, how do we prove to Kim Jong-un that his strategy cannot succeed? And so with that, I'd just like for you to step back and use your expertise. You are the father of soft power and smart power. Is there anything in your soft power, smart power toolkit that can be applied to diplomacy, can be applied in a way that might achieve some effects to reduce tension on the Korean Peninsula, and to prove to Kim Jong-un that he is just not going to be able to succeed with his political warfare and blackmail diplomacy strategy while maintaining deterrence, so that his plans for the use of force also will not succeed. So are there any soft power, smart power tools that you recommend? Thank you.
Well, those are great questions. And, if soft power is the ability to get what you want through attraction rather than coercion or payment, I think the prospects of soft power attracting Kim Jong-un away from his nuclear weapons or his hostile position are pretty slim. I think that we have to be realistic about this. Just like soft power didn't attract Putin away from his invasion of Ukraine. On the other hand, when a leader ignores soft power, he can create himself costs in terms of his hard power. When Putin essentially invaded Ukraine, he gave up Russian soft power, and the net effect of that was to increase Ukraine's hard power, because Russia suddenly became not only less attractive, but unattractive in places like Germany and Poland and elsewhere, and they provided extra equipment to the Ukrainians. And Zelensky was extremely successful in using his theatrical skills to present an attractive view of Ukraine in Europe and in the United States, which essentially, that soft power of the Ukrainians increased if you want, the hard power of the Ukrainians. So I think by analogy, in the Korean Peninsula, we shouldn't have any illusions that we're going to attract Kim Jong-un away from his strategy. The steps that you mentioned earlier are steps that I would agree with, and those are all hard power steps. But the extent to which South Korea continues to develop its own soft power and become more important on the world scene because of its soft power as well as its hard power, that I think is the place where soft power may play a role. That Kim Jong-un is not going to be able to recruit allies, and South Korea is. So in that sense, I don't see, it's an indirect effect of soft power rather than a direct effect.
Yeah, I would just say that President Trump's mantra of make the right strategic decision and there will be a brighter future for North Korea. I think that was an attempt, but that was actually a threat to Kim Jong-un. And as Dr. Jung Pak, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, often asked, who is Kim Jong-un more afraid of, the U.S. military or the Korean people in the North? And it's really the Korean people in the North when armed with information about the South. I mean, that attractiveness of the South is actually the threat to the legitimacy and rule of Kim Jong-un. And so that soft power actually undermines really everything that we do because he's most afraid of that. But thank you for your great comment.
No, I agree with that. And that's what I would call the indirect effect of soft power. And so I think it is important, but indirectly.
Thank you. Brendan Malvani, out there? Brendan?
Yes, sir. Thank you. My camera just died on us, but I wanted to take a second and step back a little bit and look at the bigger regional actor that are off of the peninsula, and that, of course, is China. And I wanted to get your thoughts on, is there a way for the U.S. to achieve some sort of right balance between the projection of strength and willingness to accommodate legitimate concerns, but also achieve the deterrence so as not to invite aggressive reactions from the PRC?
Well, it's an important question, and it obviously is affected by the overall relationship between the U.S. and China. I can remember going to China way back 30 years ago when I was in the Defense Department and talking to Chinese counterparts about the importance of putting constraints on North Korea's nuclear program, and having Chinese say to me informally, we can't stand the North Koreans. We hate their guts, but they hate our guts too. And frankly, our ability to influence them is fairly small. And even more recently, in the last, let's say, decade, I can remember non-governmental contacts and talking to Chinese about North Korea. And basically, the position is we don't want to see a nuclear weapon, but we don't want to see Americans stationed in North Korea either. And when I say, well, maybe we should have discussions along those lines, they didn't laugh it out of court. Today, it's hard to imagine either of those conversations occurring, given the relationship between the U.S. and China. It's become so poisonous, and the element of suspicion in the relationship means that while there is a basic competition, we're losing sight of the areas where cooperation would be possible. And this is not the U.S.'s fault. This is U.S. and China's fault, both of us. There's a rise in nationalism in China, and Xi Jinping is using it to play on to make sure that he keeps control. And in that sense, it's very hard to see a climate right now in which you could imagine a conversation like either of the two conversations I described relating to North Korea, which I think is unfortunate.
George Tolaraya, go ahead.
Yes, good evening. It's an honor to talk to you, Professor Nye. And I would like to suggest a little bit more hardcore scenario in case of a nuclear test, U.S. reaction, mostly a demonstrative one, maybe some kind of sanctions. And then Kim uses the opportunity just to actually attack South Korea, but not an all-out war, but just seizing, for example, some of the islands in the Yellow Sea, seizing them and occupying them and keeping them. So what would the U.S. government do in this case? What do you think?
Well, it's a pretty high risk strategy for him, but if he were to try it, I think you'd have to have some sort of a response to repel his forces. I think remember back a decade or more ago when you had the Yongbyon sinking, and there wasn't nearly a strong enough reaction on our part, in my view. And I think that if Kim were to seize some islands or to sink another South Korean ship, I think there has to be some sort of limited military action. I think it also proves that if you want, that deterrence works both ways. He thinks he's deterring us, and therefore he can take adventures. We have to show him no. We can respond to those adventures, and we're not deterred.
Larry Nix, are you ready?
Can you hear me now?
Go ahead. Great. Go ahead.
Professor Nye, actually, I have two questions. Let me start with Ukraine and make a comparison in my question with the end of the Korean War. When we were about to sign an armistice in 1953 with the Chinese and the North Koreans, we were already considering in the near term offering South Korea a mutual defense treaty. We did that within a few months after the signing of the armistice. Now, you talked about a protracted stalemate militarily in the Ukraine-Russia war. And if that continues, if you're right about that, I would expect to see several of the European countries begin to advocate and put real pressure on Ukraine to negotiate a settlement that would give some of these disputed territories to Russia. The Luhansk and Donetsk, the Azov Sea stretch, including Mariupol. If you get this kind of pressure emerging from the Europeans, and again, the context of this protracted stalemate that you're talking about, would, again, looking back at the Korean War, would there be a rationale for the United States to console NATO, all the countries which you would have to have unanimous, to say to Ukraine, negotiate a settlement and make these territorial concessions. But if you get a settlement, we will immediately offer you membership in NATO as an incentive to President Zelensky. If this scenario unfolds, again, on the basis of what you're talking about, a protracted military stalemate. And I guess the second question I have, and I will be very brief about this, defining the North Korean threat of actually going to war with nuclear weapons or otherwise, with either the US, South Korea, etc. How likely is that really? Is it as likely now as it might have been 10 years ago or 20 years ago? When you have a country, North Korea, that is stricken with COVID, hundreds of thousands of cases, which they have admitted, dire food shortages. They've had actually to go into the reserve stockpiles, which used to be solely meant for the military. And now tens of thousands of people suffering from some sort of a cholera outbreak in North Korea. How does all of that affect the real North Korean military threat? It seems to me it diminishes it. The only thing Kim Jong-un and his generals have going for them is nuclear weapons and missile capabilities. I believe more and more of their motive has to do in projecting these things and demonstrating these things with internal controls. That Kim Jong-un has to listen to his generals increasingly, like Kim Jong-il had to, as Bob Scalapino told a number of us way back in 2006. And also nuclear demonstrations and missile demonstrations maintain, substantiate this order of the Kim's invincibility, which, given their medical care system and all of these other situations they have, that invincibility is threatened now internally. They have to maintain it, so they're going to show military power more to demonstrate to their own people that the Kim dynasty is still invincible. This is kind of the way I kind of view the North Korean situation today, which is different than a lot of people, I admit. But I'd like to get your reaction to that, please.
Well, let me take the questions in reverse order. I tend to agree with you. I think the primary objective of Kim Jong-un is survival of his regime. And I think the prospect of North Korean troops sweeping south across the 38th parallel is very, very slight. And I think the prospects of North Korean use of a nuclear weapon against South Korea is also very slight, because they both would mean that North Korea would lose its primary objective, which is survival of the regime. And in that sense, given the stress that they're under because of COVID and the economic failures, this is why the diplomacy I mentioned, starting at the humanitarian end, wouldn't end the nuclear threat or the nuclear development. As you said, it's overall for winning a war. That end this vulnerability, which is to add domestic Korea. So I think on the point, I would agree. Going to your first question about what's going to happen with stalemate in it was interesting that when Macron and Schultz went to Kyiv ago, they quickly backed away from the kinds of suggestions that you'd mentioned of, having Zelensky or Ukraine talk about giving up territory. But in a sense, what's going to happen on that is, and the official position now of the US as well as the allied governments, is that this is for the Ukrainians to decide. But I think what we're going to find out is, as in most wars, the outcome is going to be determined by facts on the ground. And the prospects that Ukraine is going to develop enough military capacity to deprive the Russians of their territorial gains since 2014, absolutely not. They're not going to get Crimea back. And to deprive them of their territorial gains since February 24th also seems to me unlikely. I mean, there's talk about trying to get back to the status quo ante February 23rd. I don't see the facts on the ground supporting that. I mean, I don't see the that the Ukrainians are going to be strong enough to drive the Russians back to that. In that case, the question is, since the Western allies have said Ukraine will decide, if the Ukrainians are unable to do this, and if the costs are as high as they are in a stalemate, will the Ukrainians at some point say, we are going to have to accept a ceasefire along the lines of the equivalent of a 38th parallel? And we don't like it. We don't necessarily accept it. We're not going to declare that it's the end of the war, but it will be the status quo for a while. And so some sort of an outcome along those lines, whether it's blessed with a diplomatic chapeau called Minsk III or not, seems to be more likely. What interests me or worries me is that when you get into this next winter, it gets to be about December and January, and Russian gas is not flowing adequately, and the Europeans are starting to suffer severely on the energy front. Are they going to hold their unity? Or I think it's very likely at that point that rather than saying, as we mentioned, that Ukrainians will decide, they'll start providing suggestions to the Ukrainians about how they should decide. And that the dangers of that, of course, are what it does in terms of eroding Western unity. So I would hope that that Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan are beginning to talk to the allies about that potential, because I think it's a very real one.
Thank you. Richard White?
Thank you.
Richard.
Yeah, I have two questions to complement what my colleague Patrick Cronin said. First, and it's a pretty easy one, I think, is that former President Medvedev today and Russian officials lately have been saying that they do not anticipate any Russian-U.S. meaningful Russia-U.S. arms control for a while, presumably for years. I don't know if there's anything that would lead you to disagree with that assessment. And then second, I was interested in some of the indirect proliferation effects of the conflict. And what I'm thinking of is how Russia may behave in the future in the Korean and Iran nuclear talks. They now have more of an incentive to cooperate with North Korea and Iran, less of incentive to cooperate with us, perhaps some reason to be spiteful just to cause problems for the US. So I was curious about that possible route to disrupting the global non-proliferation regime.
Well, I think there is a danger, Richard, along those lines. Russia is a declining power in the sense of demography and the adjustment of its economy to what's called the fourth industrial revolution. It's lagging. But the strategy that's often pursued by declining powers is to accept risk. And being a spoiler is one way to accept risk. And so I think as a spoiler, the prospects of Russia being even more of a spoiler than now are probably fairly large. I think that from a long-term strategic point of view, one of the interesting questions for the U.S., and this relates to the first part of your question, is at some stage we want to, in the sense that putting Russia in the situation of a Chinese satellite or junior is not in. And so the question of can you find ways to deal with some areas maybe so that you're not driven entirely into the Chinese arms. In that sense, one of the areas where you do have a common interest is in managing the nuclear relationship. And so I think if you say is the prospect for sitting down in Geneva to talk about extending the arms control agreements now strikes me as fanciful. But if a couple of years, who knows? It might be something which is an avenue toward not just managing the nuclear relationship, but toward this larger strategic interest of not driving the Russians totally into the Chinese embrace. But these are speculations. I mean, and again, in the midst of a war which is so uncertain, it's hard to put a time horizon on that.
Thank you. Julia Cho out there? Julia?
Yes, here. Thank you.
Go ahead.
I really appreciate, Professor, your invaluable insight. I think you already mentioned in your presentation on the lessons from the Ukraine war, but still here in Korea, one of the concerns some experts express is that the DPRK might learn some lessons from the Ukraine war, which reinforce Kim's belief to keep developing nuclear program rather than diminishing it. So I am wondering if any, the DPRK learned the lessons from the Ukraine war, what would they be from your perspective? Thank you.
Well, that's an interesting question. It really should be answered by somebody who's a greater insight into the mentality of DPRK leadership than I have. So I will give you what I would call a rational actor analysis. And the danger, and that's when you don't know something, you say, what would I do if I were in that situation? When I was head of the National Intelligence Council, I often warned analysts against mirror imaging because it's not that the other actor that you're assessing is irrational. It's that they see the world differently and they apply rationality to a different cultural background. So my reaction, if I were Kim Jong-un, and I very distinctly am not, I would say I'd better be careful. On the one hand, on the positive side, the Americans are now distracted and pinned somewhat by this situation in Europe and worsening of relations with China. That gives me a maneuver, so I can try some things that might I wouldn't try under normal circumstances. But I might have not have tried, let's say, on February 23rd. So that's one possible calculation. The other calculation is I look at the vaunted Soviet or Russian military, and I say, these people, everybody said they were going to be able to overwhelm Ukraine in no time. And it turns out that some of this Russian military equipment isn't so great after all. And I own some of that stuff, A. And B, as many people have said, in military friends of mine have said, that morale is 3 times the value of equipment. And the Ukrainians have this morale. And if I were to attack that, it's my Russian military. I think it should be A, and B. Do my troops, given the situation, have the morale I'm going to need to overcome the deficiencies in equipment. Maybe if I want to preserve the regime, I'd better be careful and just, be more cautious. So on the one hand, it opens up opportunities because the Americans are distracted and the Chinese are angry at the Americans. On the other hand, the lesson from the failure of the Russians makes me say maybe it's not a good time to take an adventure. But as I said, this is my mirror imaging. This is the kind of thing I used to warn analysts against when I ran the National Intelligence Council, because I'm thinking like Joe Nye, and Kim Jong-il is not like Joe Nye.
Okay, Richard Wang, go ahead. Richard.
Hey, hi. Thank you very much, Professor Nye. I have a question to Professor Nye. China announced yesterday that it has successfully tested a missile interception test. So what does that signal to you? What does it mean to you? Is it some people say it is a China's answer to the THAAD system, and what does it mean for U.S.-Korea alliance? Thank you.
Well, I think we're going to see tests of all sorts of weapon systems from time to time, and sometimes announcing that a test is politically useful to pick your timing to make it a reply to something that you don't like diplomatically or politically. But I don't place too much significance to these tests. I mean, there was a great fuss a year or so ago about hypersonics, and Putin made a great fuss, and so did the Chinese, of talking about their hypersonic tests, and many people in Washington became very anxious about this. Hypersonics may have some effect on tactical situations. They don't strike me as changing the strategic situation much, because in terms of the ability to have a strategic attack on another country, we know that traditional or standard intercontinental ballistic missile defense is imperfect, and the fact that you can do it a little faster now with a hypersonic doesn't change that. You're not going to be able to protect the country with the anti-ballistic missile systems we have now. So having a hypersonic missile may change a tactical situation where speed and maneuverability in a local setting, it makes a difference. Doesn't really change the strategic situation that much. Sometimes people call this the hype about hypersonics. But I think a lot of these, there are various levels of missile tests. And I think the question is, I don't think any of them are showstoppers in terms of changing the military balance. What they are is political bargaining chips.
Thank you. Nobuo Tanaka. Nobuo?
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Go ahead.
Hi, Joe. Very good to see you again after the Trilateral Commission in Washington.
It's been about 1 week since we saw each other.
Just true. That's true. I just want to ask you the question which I raised at the last session of the Trilateral. The thing is that Japan is, the peaceful user of the nuclear power, but to maintain our capability, still we have a really difficulty after the Fukushima accident. So Patrick Cronin's issue about the collapse of the non-proliferation regime certainly concerns us a lot. And my, let's say, point was, should Japan develop together with the United States and maybe with Korea, the kind of advanced reactor system which was, I mentioned as an integral fast reactor system, does it give a more sustainable nuclear future, and that kind of collaboration for peaceful use could be the way to encourage the peaceful use of the nuclear power, not going toward the weapon states, and also at the same time to maintain the capability of Japan, I think Japan should have a nuclear submarine, joining AUKUS and make it a JOKUS, and spending our additional military expenditures coming after this Ukraine situation. Maybe we have to think about investing into the nuclear propulsion submarine, not a weapon, but propulsion submarine. And for that, maybe the cover for this kind of activity of nuclear related issues in Japan, I think Japan should join, or at least to be an observer to the nuclear weapon ban treaty. What is your view? What is your view on these points? Thank you.
Well, I think to start with your first point that we are going to need nuclear energy for reasons of climate change, and so the world is going to need nuclear energy. And I'd much rather have nuclear plants built by Japan or Korea or the United States built by Russians and Chinese. The cooperation with the IAEA, the insistence on safety, the avoidance of corruption. I think we talked about the liberation potential of peaceful energy. I feel much safer if it's built by Koreans or Japanese than Russians. So that means I'd rather not have Rosatom building. On the question of Japan joining AUKUS, I don't know. I'd have to know a lot more about the details of AUKUS, which I don't know. Certainly, Japan working closely with Britain and Australia, the U.S. And thinking in terms of nuclear propulsion submarines makes sense to me. But as I understand it, this is a long-term proposal. We're talking about a decade or so. And whether, how, I don't know enough about how the arrangements and diplomacy of AUKUS are working. Sometimes when you add a new partner to an existing framework, it slows things down. But I don't know how to judge that because I don't know the details. So I think I just reserve open the question about Japan joining AUKUS. I'm not opposed to it in a way. But I don't know how effective it would be, at least in the short run. On the question of being an observer of the nuclear weapons ban, I think the nuclear weapons ban treaty is I think it's not realistic, and the nuclear weapon states have adhered to it. And I don't see a world in which we're going to see a ban on nuclear weapons or abolition of nuclear weapons in the next decade or two. But as a long-run goal, as Obama said in his speech at Prague, it's a reasonable long-run goal, just as a denuclearized North Korea is a reasonable long-run goal, as long as we realize this type of goal is aspirational rather than operational. And so, if having Japan as an observer there, it makes sense, and I don't see any reason why not, as long as it doesn't interfere with Japan's realistic defense policy, which is that it's going to need deterrence, and that's going to require the alliance with a nuclear weapons state, the U.S., to provide the counterbalancing against China and North Korea. So basically, I'm in agreement with you, Nobuo, but with those caveats.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Donald.
much.
Okay, very good. Donald Kirk.
Sir, you mentioned earlier that you didn't think that the U.S. and maybe South Korea as well had responded adequately to the sinking of the Chonon, in which I think 46 sailors died, or the shelling of Yongbyon Island, in which another 4 people were killed. You said the response wasn't adequate. I wonder what you think would be an adequate response to a similar incident. Do you think that the U.S. and ROK should attack the bases from which the North Koreans staged these incidents? And what would be the consequences of that? Would then there be a spiraling series of episodes that would result in armed conflict all along the DMZ and elsewhere? I just wonder whether you could go into what you think how do you think the U.S. really should have responded to those incidents, and what the U.S. should do now in case of similar incidents?
Well, the first choice for response has to be by the government in Seoul. I mean, it was a South Korean ship, the Jonan, and it was a South Korean island, Yongbyon. So it wasn't for the Americans to decide. But if I had been ambassador to Korea, or if I'd been Secretary of State, and my Korean counterpart had asked me, I would have said, I think you better respond a little strongly, because otherwise we're going to weaken our deterrence of North Korea. So let's, for a counterfactual or a hypothetical, let's imagine that Kim Jong-un decides to lob a few more shells at Yongbyon. And how should we respond? Well, again, the answer to that has to be for President Yoon. But if he asked my opinion, I'd say I would try to identify the source of the missiles or the batteries that committed this attack, and I would remove them by force. And I think the danger is if you don't do that, and Kim Jong-un says, oh, my new nuclear weapons are deterring them, maybe I should try a little bit more. It seems to me you have to make clear right away that, that this is unacceptable. Now, is there a danger that this could escalate? Yes, there is. On the other hand, if it's limited, it may not, because if you look at the conventional balance along the 30th parallel, I think it's in our favor. You know, in that sense, and if you look at the nuclear balance, as I mentioned earlier, there's no question but that it's in our favor. So that would be my response. But is there some risk to it? Yes. But there's also a risk of not doing anything.
Well, thank you very much. Time is up. Professor Nye, this is a great evening. And we thank you very much, and we'll get back to you.
Well,
ladies and gentlemen, time is up.
I enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you very much. We'll get back to you, Joe.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.